campus community, but with the entire surrounding region as we effort to become Kern County's university. I would like to thank our sponsors this evening, Valley Strong Credit Union. Let's give them a hand. And the Kegley family. Let's give them a hand. I'd like to expressly thank Dr. Jackie Kegley for her support of this event and for her presence here this evening. Dr. Kegley, could you stand and be recognized? So, and in thinking about this evening's event and in speaking with Dr. Pastor before we walked over here, I think that one of the reflections that I'll share with you is about how this particular talk that we are all going to hear this evening and that we are going to be engaged with about how this is connected to the work that we do here at this institution, but also how the work that we do here is connected to many other places where similar work is being done. And I think that as a result of this, like I said previously, we're in for a real treat. We will be able to think about, reflect, and engage with the content of the talk. And so it is, I'm going to leave it to Dr. Olson, to Nate, to provide the full introduction for Dr. Pastor, but it is truly an honor and privilege to welcome you all to this event this evening and to wish you to take away whatever it is that each of us will walk away with, but that we also collectively are able to walk away with something that we will be able to carry forward from this evening's presentation. So with that, welcome, and I'm going to hand the microphone back to Dr. Olson.
Thank you, Dr. Rodriguez. In addition to Valley Strong Credit Union and the Kegley family, the Office of the Provost is the third sponsor for tonight's talk. So I want to thank Dr. Rodriguez for your support. So let's give him a round of applause here too. Additionally, I'd like to thank the CCB students who are helping assist with tonight's event. You see them out there and they'll be in here too, helping when we do the Q&A portion. They're all members of CCB's Sensational Sophomores program. Please help, or let's give them a round of applause too. Okay, as Provost Rodriguez mentioned, this is the Kegley Institute of Ethics 20th annual fall lecture. And you know, we've had the good fortune to host many fantastic speakers over the years, including, well, you can see some up on the screen that were up here before, including Gregory Boyle was on there with Homeboy Industries as one of our fall speakers a few years past, Dolores Huerta, Arun Gandhi. We've had many speakers over the course of the years. Our mission at the Kegley Institute is to inspire ethical understanding and action. So it's two parts. Both develop broader, deeper understanding of ethical issues important for our times, and then inspire you to go act once you leave our events. The many wonderful speakers we've hosted over the years, both our fall lecture and our spring Charles Kegley Memorial Lecture, have helped us advance that mission. Tonight's speaker, Dr. Manuel Pastor, fits perfectly in that tradition. Dr. Pastor is a distinguished professor of sociology and American studies and ethnicity at the University of Southern California, where he also directs the Equity Research Institute. He's a prolific scholar. By my count, he's authored 18 books. I won't dare try to list them all right now, but the most recent of them you may have seen on your way in. He'll be signing copies of Charging Forward, Lithium Valley Electric Vehicles and a Just Future. We'll be able to purchase a copy and sign after the talk tonight. That book builds on Dr. Pastor's career-long focus on the economic, environmental, and social conditions facing low-income communities as well as the social movements seeking to change those realities. He's a scholar who will deepen your understanding of the problems in our world, but also show you how to act to better it. So as I said, a perfect fit for our mission at the Kegley Institute of Ethics. Before this book, Dr. Pastor published 2 books in 2021, Solidarity Economics, Why Mutuality and Movements Matter, and then also South Central Dreams, Finding Home and Building Community in South LA. Those 2 titles further illustrate the kind of work that he does. His PhD's in economics, and he brings his deep understanding of social science to bear on contemporary social realities. For his work in public affairs and public policy, Dr. Pastor was elected in 2022 to the American Academy for the Arts and Sciences. He's no ivory tower scholar, though. He's one who's deeply engaged in communities around the country and especially in California. For decades, he's worked with public agencies, community boards, nonprofit organizations to effect social change. For instance, as we were talking about just before the talk, he serves with one of our local members, Traco Matthews, on the California Racial Equity Commission. He also serves on the Governor's Council of Economic Advisors. And he's received several awards for his community engagement work, including the Civic Entrepreneur of the Year Award from the California Center for Regional Leadership and the Champion for Equity Award from Catalyst, California. After he's done with his talk, he'll take questions from the audience. So please be thinking of things as he's talking up here, and we'll take questions from you all after that. So his talk tonight is entitled Looking Forward, Centering Equity and Building Community in a Changing America. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Pastor to CSUB.
I prefer the lounge singer approach where you walk around the stage. Thank you for that introduction. The data point I always use, though, is that I've been married for 43 years. Now, that's an important part of your personality. As my wife and I say, we've been married 43 years, many of them happily. So glad to be with you. My understanding is that yesterday you had a rain and wind storm. Then on the weekend you had a chemical fire. And then just last week we had a political earthquake. And what I'm gonna wanna try to do with you today is to talk a little bit about the fault lines that led to that earthquake. That is, we know that when an earthquake takes place, you need to be worried about them here in California, that they can come all of a sudden. They can come without much warning, although apparently seismologists are getting better at it. But they're not entirely unpredictable because they represent fault lines, schisms in our earth, in our particular case, in our body politic. And that's what I'm going to want to talk about tonight. I always like to let people know before I start speaking, if my voice tires out or sounds soft or sounds halting, you might think it's because of screaming at the television for the last week at pundits who seem to have no knowledge of what they're speaking. That's one reason. But I also have a voice condition that's called spasmodic dysphonia, spasms around the voice box, which causes your voice to break or be scratchy unless it's treated. In fact, it is the condition that Robert Kennedy Jr. has. If you ever heard him, his voice is really scratchy. So if my voice was not treated, it is. I would sound like Robert Kennedy Jr. I would not be as delusional as Robert Kennedy Jr., but I would sound like him. And the way it gets treated, this is true once a month, is with Botox. which is why I look so damn good. So this is a shock that we've been through with the electoral outcome. Some ways predictable, some ways not. But the big swing of it was in some ways somewhat of a shock. But I'd like to think a little bit more about the context of what we've been through over the last, gosh, nearly 20 years, only really 15. We saw in 2008 a financial crash, which basically suggested that the capitalist emperor had no clothes. That is, that the people who were so skilled at managing our economy had managed to run it into the ground. And it gave rise to a populist movement, We Are the 99%, which failed to gain traction because they were not interested in organizing, just protesting. A little bit of a lesson to pay attention to there. That financial crash led to the election of Barack Obama. There were other reasons for it as well. First, Black president in US history, followed immediately by a Tea Party backlash and the rise of the right wing, eventually giving way as politics went on to the election, surprising even to him in 2016, of Donald Trump to the presidency. Some of you are students, probably weren't following it as much back then. I was a political junkie when I was 12 years old. But you could tell that he himself was surprised by his victory and arrived to the presidency with not a whole lot of competence at doing what he was intending to do, something that eventually got revealed, the incompetence during the COVID crisis. But it also meant that a lot of the sort of wilder to the right ideas of Trump were not fully implemented, but it did create a lot of unease in the country for immigrants, for others. This was followed by COVID, worldwide disaster, in which the sheer inability to deal with that crisis spoke to our incapacities to care for each other. And quite quickly in that arena came the murder of George Floyd and the period of racial reckoning, which has since moved on to once again racial backlash. And then just last week, the election, after a period of difficult inflation and disinflation, number of other reasons, of Donald Trump and the heralding of Trump 2.0. If you're young, you can be forgiven thinking, man, that's a lot to go on in my lifetime. That is shock after shock after shock after shock. Some of them, for some people, positive. Some who were delighted by the election of Obama, some devastated, similar reactions to Trump, but shock after shock after shock. And what I want to do with you is talk about the fault lines. And I want to say that the two basic fault lines have been the changing demography of the United States and the growing sense of income inequality and despair that tie all of those things together. The financial crash, the Obama election, the Trump era, COVID, which was the disease that revealed our illnesses as a society, the the racial wealth gap, which meant that some did not have a cushion on which to survive, the essential workers who were treated as though they were disposable. And of course, what's gone on recently. So what does that look like? Nate mentioned that I'm an economist. What that means is that I love graphs. And I'm hoping by the end of this presentation, you will love graphs too. If you don't, I won't like you anymore, but graphs are important. So what this tells us is the changing demography of the country, which is slated to become majority non-white by about the year 2045, 2046. It is a change that has created fear on the part of some about an America of the past slipping away. It's created delight for others. For those of us from Los Angeles, all we can think is that the rest of the United States will soon know the joy of a Korean taco truck. But it's created turmoil. But what's interesting, if you look at that demographic change between 2000 and 2050, going from being about 69% non-Hispanic white to about 48% non-Hispanic white, that's basically the change that California went through between 1980 and 2000. California was America fast forward. And that period of time in California's history saw Proposition 187, the stripping away of services from undocumented Californians, saw the largest civil unrest in US history, the 1992 unrest in Los Angeles, elimination of bilingual education, elimination of affirmative action, a rapid march through over-incarceration. So that turmoil in California was a sort of signal of what the nation is going through and will be going through. What's interesting, this, by the way, I'll have a few charts on Kern County. This is Kern County. You've been changing dramatically. By the year 2060, you will be 80% Latino. Bakersfield will be renamed as El Campo de Baker. Things will change. But anyway, demographic change here as well. What's fascinating is that what people think is driving the demographic change nationally is no longer true. Most people think that the demographic change has to do with immigration. But while there was a pretty sharp increase in the share of US residents who are foreign born between, say, 1990 and 2008, it's been very slow since. Certainly the last couple of years saw a significant influx of immigrants at the border, and it's the disorder at the border that created a lot of fears for people. But what's fascinating is that we're not actually seeing the share of foreign born go up all that dramatically, although we're seeing the fear of the foreign born go up dramatically. And it's also partly because where the foreign born are going now is different than in the past. What this chart shows you is the share of all immigrants in the United States who live in California. And in 1990, fully a third of all immigrants in the United States lived in California. And that sort of made sense because, believe it or not, in the 1970s and 1980s, half of all immigrants coming to the United States settled in California. In fact, in the 1970s and 1980s, nearly a quarter of all immigrants coming into the United States settled in Los Angeles. So big, dramatic changes. And what that's led people to think is that those changes will continue to occur in the same way. But in fact, as you can see here, the share of the foreign born in California, of all the immigrants in the United States in California, it's now about 22%. Where are the immigrants? They're going to other states. The South, and we can see this by looking at the share of Latinos. It's not immigrants, but this is interesting. Share of Latinos where they lived in 1990, about 35% in California, about 20% in Texas, New York, Florida, Illinois. Where do you think people live? But look at the South. The South had about 3.6% of all Latinos in the United States. What does that look like now? Much different. The South has about 10% of all Latinos. The share living in the Midwest has gone up dramatically. Partly it's people who are looking for cheaper housing, partly for people looking for calmer lives than big cities like Los Angeles. But what it means is that there's a lot of change occurring, and that change is occurring in places that have never seen immigrants before, have never seen Latinos before, and that's a bit of the reaction that's occurring. And you could see this by looking at a map of the United States. This is a map for the counties of the United States. The browner the county, the higher the share of people of color. And what you can see here is that in 1980, the United States looked like some people still think it looks, the black belt of the South, going up to DC, the borderlands of Texas with Mexico, the Hispanic and Native American areas of New Mexico, Arizona, Native American areas in the Dakotas. But look at California in 1980. There was only one county that was majority people of color, Imperial, which helped produce your interim provost. He comes from Calexico. No other state was majority people of color. As you move to 1990, change, 2000, lots of change, but again, lots of it's occurring in California. 2010, 2020. What you can see is that still some change in California, but it's slowing down. Change is occurring in the rest of the country. And as you move forward to the future, diversity is coming to a theater near you. In unexpected places. So for example, that's Salt Lake City. Salt Lake City is projected to become majority people of color by the year 2035. I know that's a shock, because when you think Salt Lake, you think not just white, but shiny white. Book of Mormon white, right? So, but partly because it's got a large Mormon presence where people do missionary work, they've been open to immigrants coming from both Latin America and Africa, and that's changing their demography. So big demographic change. And interestingly, currently what's driving it, not geographically, but in terms of the numbers, is no longer as much immigration as kids. Kids being born to those immigrants who are here. You can see this is the change in the youth population in the last couple of decades. The youth population of white folks, young white people under the age of 18, actually has fallen by 9 million. This is a quiz for those studying sociology. That does not mean that 9 million young white people died. We would have noticed it. There would have been a shortage of demand for avocado toast. It's not just white kids. My Latino children, vegans, are big into the avocado toast too. But what it is that there's more young white people moving into 18, 19, and 20 than moving into 0 and 1. So the net number falls. So where is the growth in children occurring? It's occurring in the Latino population and in the Asian population. The young Black population has been falling, but a large part of that is people who used to just say they were Black, who are now saying they're multiracial. So big demographic change, but it's left this early era of immigration has left its impact. So for example, this is Kern County, mixed status families. So it's the number of undocumented people, then the number of US citizens living with an undocumented family member, then lawful permanent residents, green card holders, living with an undocumented family member. Something really interesting for you to note here. There is more US citizen family members and green card family members living with undocumented people than there are undocumented people. So mass deportation is mass family separation and will impact beyond the undocumented residents themselves. Gonna jump over those slides and just say one other thing that helps you think about the centrality of where you live. So this is a chart looking in this case at all the children in the state of California, where they live and where demographers tell us they will live in the future. And one thing for you to note is the very sharp decline in the share of the state's children in Los Angeles. Now, there's a couple of reasons for that, but it's been a phenomenon that's been going on for some time. If you want to impress friends with your demographic knowledge, which of course is always a badge of honor, here's an interesting tidbit. Of the 100 largest metropolitan areas in the United States, the only metro area in the last decade that has not seen an increase in the number of Hispanic children, Los Angeles. Because LA, Latinos are more likely to be second generation. If they're immigrant, they're long settled. The longer you're in the country, the more your family formation patterns get like the US norm, just kind of replacing yourself. And also high housing prices are inducing people to move to places like Bakersfield, particularly if they're about to form a family. And you could see that in the data because where the share of children are going to be going up, San Diego Imperial, Inland Empire, and of course the Central Valley. So that's the underlying demographic change, nationwide, statewide, and a bit of a glimpse here at Kern County. That's a lot of disruption. And the disruption feeds into unease. It also creates something that people didn't necessarily expect, which is something that just popped up if you're looking at the exit polls and other evidence from the recent election, which is a shift toward Trump, toward the right, of Latinos, probably overstated in the exit polls because it's always wrong, but it's there nonetheless. And some of that, there's a bunch we'll talk about, but some of that demographically is a second and third generation feeling less connection to the newest immigrants. And that's partly because of the way that immigration is no longer as big a definer as it was in the past. But let's talk about economics, because that's another fault line along with the demographic change that has helped to produce this political earthquake. Now, part of that is the increase in income inequality in the United States. This chart looks at the share of national income going to various groups. The blue line is what we'll pay attention to. It's the top 1%. And what you can see here is that the share of income going to the top 1% is now higher than at any time in recorded US history. Higher than the Gilded Age, and generally twice, approaching 2.5 times higher than it was during the 50s, 60s, and most of the 70s. The big changes here start to happen 1979, 1980, with the election of Ronald Reagan and the shift in our economy at that time. Another marker of this, in the 1960s, the average CEO, chief executive officer of a top 100 company made about 30 times what the average worker in his firm made. They were almost all men. Made about 30 times what the average worker made. Any guesses to what the ratio is now? 350 times. So a tenfold increase for a group of CEOs who shipwrecked the economy in 2008 and had to be rescued by the public sector. So there's a resentment of economic elites that's fed over into resentment of other kinds of intellectual, university, professional elites as well, partly because what's gone on, this is a chart, just look at it as though it's a pretty picture, I'll explain it to you, which is in the period between 45 to about the mid 1970s. When US productivity rose, worker wages rose at about the same rate. So it meant if the company did better, so did you. But for the last 30 years, when the company does better, you do worse. So there's a lot of economic distress and unrest. And while it's easy to point the finger at the top 1% who have run away from the rest, it's also the case that if you take the wages for people who are full-time year-round workers, so professional middle-class people, manufacturing workers, nurses, care workers, gardeners, people have jobs, that if you go to the 90th percentile, 10% make more, 90% make less. 80th percentile, 20 make more, 80 make less, etc. What you could see is at the top, People's wages have gone up. The gray bars are for the United States. The gold bars for the Golden State, California. And that's true at the 80th percentile as well. In the middle, wages have stagnated, and at the bottom, wages have fallen. If you don't like charts, and again, I can't understand why. The easy way to think about this is that I'm a professor. I make a lot more money than professors ever made because I speak a few languages, technically skilled. Apparently, I can write a lot of books. My dad was a janitor. If he was alive, he would make a lot less money than he ever made because that is not being rewarded in the same way as it was before. Pet peeve, then back to the lecture. A lot of economists talk about this as a changing return to skill. It takes a lot of skill to be a janitor. You walked in here, this was clean, this was nice. Somebody did that. How many of you have children? How many of you take your children? Some of your children might be a little older, like mine, might take your children to childcare. When you drop them off, do you think, boy, I'm glad those people have no skills? You know they've got great skills. They just don't have great wages for those skills. So it's not just that the 1% have run away from the rest, but the professional middle class has been hoarding the best schools, the best neighborhoods, the best paths to college, and others have been slipping. And one other thing to bring it to Kern County, this is job growth since 1980. The blue line is Kern County, green is California, gray is the United States. One thing to notice here is that Kern County has grown more jobs than California or the United States. Sounds like that should be good news until you look at the earnings per job. So Kern County has grown lots of bad jobs. And that also feeds into a sense of unease, distrust, disquiet. There are clear racial dimensions to this in terms of much higher poverty rates for Black and Latino households. This chart, which I won't get into, basically lets you know that while education is an important part of it, it doesn't explain all of it. Even when you hold education levels constant, there's still penalty for being Black, Latino, or Asian. The Asian penalty only is eliminated with a BA degree. So there's still both a combination of discrimination in labor markets and also what are called network effects, which is who you know and how it helps connect you to good or bad jobs. Last chart, then I'll jump over the charts and move to some things that have words and pictures to help some of you. This is for that county south ULA, median household income. As you can see here, a pattern you would expect, much higher household income for white households compared to Black or Latino households. In the LA case, also higher than for AAPI households. What I want to show you now, same location, LA County, same groups, same y-axis, so the same scale. But we're going to look at households raising children under the age of 5. Looks what happened to those gaps. So white households raising kids have income levels 2.5 times that for Black and Latino households. So baking inequality in as we move forward. So what does this mean, these fall lines, for this current moment? So first, if we try to think about this, I think it's important to recognize that we need a new economic narrative. And we tried to contribute to that with one of the books you mentioned, Solidarity Economics, which, by the way, there's a website for it called solidarityeconomics.org. You can download the book for free. And there's a comic book version in English and Spanish for popular education. But the basic point of the book is something very simple, which we've lost sight of. I am lucky enough at USC to have an endowed chair. And in this particular case, the chair is actually endowed. I mean, there's money in it. So I asked the very wealthy business person who endowed the chair, full of pearls of wisdom. I said, Jerry, how did you become so rich? Here was his answer. I treated my customers right. I treated my workers right. I treated my suppliers right, and it all worked out. And if you think about it, that's common sense. If you're a business that wants to sustain itself for a long time, you treat people fairly. If you're a teacher that wants to survive, you treat your students fairly. If you're part of a team working with people, you treat people fairly and decently. So how we've been captured by an economic ideology that rising inequality and rising desperation is actually going to generate economic prosperity doesn't make sense to me. The evidence we present in this book is in favor of equity, and the arguments are as well. The second thing that's needed with these fault lines is a different discussion of race and racism. We have found ourselves needing to have a different discussion because it's polarized into people who want to ignore the reality of racism versus people who insist so much on that that it's hard to look for the commonality. We need a discussion that recognizes difference as we work to common ground. What does that need to look like? I think it needs to be data oriented. Because I think when we look at those statistics, we start to think about our future in a different way. It needs to be forward looking, not just backward casting about what we've done wrong, but what we need to do to get it right. We need to have these conversations face to face, bringing people together in faith communities, civic organizations, unions, educational institutions, and solidarity oriented, looking for the common ground. We need to create a new sense of interdependence. And let me just say a couple things to make that clear. Now, I have to check whether this data point is still true this year, but it was true 2 or 3 years ago. So it's probably close to being true. What county in California do you think has the highest share of residents who are undocumented? San Diego Imperial? Not correct, but good guess. Santa Clara County, the home of Silicon Valley. Because behind every software engineer is an army of nannies and food service workers and gardeners. And if you look at this chart, this shows you, somehow I managed to, Dad, thank you. This chart shows you our growth in high-tech employment and our growth in how nursing, elder, family, home health, and childcare services. There's interdependence going on here. If you want high tech and innovation, you need service workers. You don't get Tesla without coffee shops. Second thing, this is a demographer's favorite. It's a demographic pyramid for the United States. We call them pyramids because traditionally you have a lot of young people, less middle-aged, and then as the age gets older and older and older, we step off the stage. What you can see here, I think it's quite interesting, is that in 1950, the United States had a demographic pyramid. Lots of young people, baby boomers, lots of people in the middle, people didn't survive that long. But as time has gone on, lower birth rates, better health care, the demographic pyramid has become a demographic cylinder. And that means the following thing. The dependency of retirees on the working age population is becoming higher. And projected in the state of California to become about 40% higher over the next 30 years. So that means that all you young people here, we want you to be successful so you can pay for us. Which means we need to invest in the next generation so they can be successful. And that sense of interdependence has not been part of the national conversation. The last thing is that we need to pay much more attention to effectiveness and accountability. People have lost faith in government to solve problems. So we need to pay attention to measuring what's happening and solving problems. So a couple last thoughts, and then Nate will come up and facilitate Q&A. First, for those who are on the winning side of the last election, practice grace, not gloating. For those who are on the losing side, do analysis, not blame. These are long-term trends, big problems. They require serious discussion. Neither gloating nor blame builds a new table for conversation. Second, understand that we're in the middle of deep demographic and economic transformation. I haven't even talked about that, but for all of you not yet thinking about the future, should be worried about artificial intelligence. Is that professional middle class that thought it was shielded? Sorry, kids. There's a machine that can do that work almost as well as you. Had a upfront experience with that with the new book, because we were talking to people doing our publicity. We had done a couple of book events, and I said, man, the questionnaires, they're asking crappy questions. So my co-author fed the book into ChatGPT and asked ChatGPT to come up with 10 questions. 9 of them were the best questions I've seen. 1 was off. There goes the journalist's job. So there's lots of disruption ahead, lots of transformation. Try to think about a vision, not just an issue. Try to stir a conversation and not a conversion. Conversion means I know I'm right. I'm not planning on listening to you, but I'm looking for weak points that I can bring you to my side. Conversation is listening to what someone is telling you about their fear, their pain, their aspirations, their hopes, trying to find where you can come together. In this current moment, many of the communities that some of us care about will be threatened, particularly immigrant communities. How do we protect them? How do we understand how to scale up? And then finally, I will close with this. I was at a session this past Saturday of a number of people also trying to process the election, not as much in a long-term way. And I thought about my favorite quote. And I know that my favorite quote ought to be something by Cesar Chavez or Martin Luther King or someone truly inspirational. But my favorite quote is from the economist, John Maynard Keynes, who at the end of his life was giving a talk. And a young man filled with great confidence came up to him at the end of the talk and said, Lord Keynes, been anointed a Lord at this point. Something you said in your talk contradicted something you wrote 20 years ago. Now people do that, they feel quite proud of themselves. And Keynes said, well, when I'm wrong, I change my mind. What do you do? And what I want to encourage all of us to do is don't change your values, but change your mind. What about this information shook up what you were already thinking? What about this talk will cause you to rethink? What about this moment will cause you to recharge? Don't be afraid to change your mind. It's not the same thing as changing your values around integrity, justice, honest, and the dignity of all human beings. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Pastor. So we have some students here who will bring microphones to people if you have a question. So please raise your hand if you have a question and we'll bring a microphone to you. I see we've got hand back here. I also have questions here, but and I swear they're not written by Chat GPT, but they might have been better, I guess, if they were. But we'll go. Let's go to the back here. Sure, we got the mic going first. There we go.
Professor, my name is Jesus Garcia, and I was really involved in redistricting this past session. I was working for what's called the Equitable Maps Coalition. As Dolores Huerta. In that process, I'd like to talk about an issue that I think I would like your advice on. Some of the folks that we were working with that we thought were community, in some cases, were very difficult to work with. And what I'm talking about here is the growing Black-Brown divide in politics. What we, as you've mentioned with the demography, with your data, the African-American community has been decreasing both in LA and across the board, with the Latino community growing. With that comes political ramifications, as we saw in LA, city councils and school districts and all of that. And as we were working together, I spent more time than I wanted trying to defend our work among our colleagues, if you will. It didn't always go the way we were hoping, and I think some of the results played out. I can talk about this forever, but what advice do you have going forward, Professor, on breaching that gap that's growing among African Americans and the Latino community? And I think part of that is what impacted this election of a Black woman losing with probably a lot of Latino votes against her. So lots in there. And
Yeah, what a great, well, it's really nice to get the easy questions first. So a couple of things about redistricting and then stepping back. Redistricting is one of those zero-sum activities where one group's gain really is another group's loss. And so I think one of the things that is crucial that was there somewhat in the redistricting, but probably needed more is experience working with each other on other things where there's a positive gain that can be gotten from both groups working together. Wages, better schools, environmental protection, etc., so that the times where there's actual conflicts, like around how you draw lines, don't lead to permanent ruptures and distrust. But that's easier said than done. The electoral outcome is, again, I think the exit polls are always wrong for Latinos. They don't know how to sample Latinos. But the shift is so large that there actually has already been some calling out of Latinos, particularly Latino males, for not voting for Harris, the Black female candidate. I think that could wind up creating more divisions between the groups because there's actually also on the Latino side a sense of underrepresentation that feeds into some resentment of what is by that group thought to be an outsized Black political voice. So it's going to require a lot of work. It's actually been a big part of my life's work. Since the late 1980s, I've been involved in building alliances between Black, Latino, and AAPI populations. The book South Central Dreams is about the emergence of Black, Brown organizing in South LA. And a lot of that had to do with learning to substitute or complement race identity with place identity, with pride in being from South Los Angeles, no matter what ethnicity you were, as a way of bringing people together and beginning to understand that in that place anyway, the disinvestment that Latinos face was etched in place by anti-Black racism. And so that needs to be part of the struggle. But you're absolutely right that this is going to heat up in the next few years. And those of us who want to find common ground are going to find ourselves overworked trying to do that.
Thank you for that question. So we had a question on this side, is that right? Over here? Yes.
Hello, my name is Jose Sanchez, or one of the most common names among Latinos. So a question I had. So currently, I'm doing a project with some truly exceptional gentlemen. We were predicting how Latinos will vote in the 2024 election, and we were pretty accurate. We predicted that Harris would get a slight lead on the votes, while with Trump getting a little less than half, which turned out to be pretty accurate. Um, the reason I'm going to be asking this question is because I found it rather interesting. So today we were looking at a presentation of how Black voters voted, and it showed regardless of the rural versus urban divide, they voted pretty loyally to the Democratic Party, but that's not the case with the Latino divide between urban and rural. Why do you think that's the case?
So I think there's a lot of divides in the Latino community that help to explain this vote. First is there's a big gender gap. So I think, to some extent I was a bit surprised by it, but I think it's, when people say it's machismo, they act as though patriarchal attitudes are somehow a Latino only thing. So I think that's wrong, but there's a big rejection of women as leaders. And that honestly did happen. I was sharing earlier that I spoke to my favorite bartender, which is where all knowledge comes. But he's at a restaurant and he's a 63-year-old Latino born in Mexico. Spent a lot of time here. Kids are doing well, etc. And he was just saying, I didn't like either of them. Which seems like a reasonable attitude to me. Until he said, what he said about Harris was not about policy, but he said, I just couldn't imagine her being a leader, standing up to Putin and other leaders in the world. And I was thinking, in comparison to Trump, right, who was kind of a lapdog for Putin. So I realized what a bubble I'm in, because I'm in a world in which there are lots of powerful, intelligent, capable women that I feel a lot of respect for. But for some Latinos, that's not there. Now, there's another divide you didn't mention, religion. So when you look at Protestant Latinos, big swing to Trump. Because I think abortion for that group is as important as deportation. And there's a whole cultural coming together with white Protestants. If you look at the Catholic Latino vote, and again, caution, the more and more you slice this vote, the less reliable the data is. But Catholic vote looks like it's about as democratic as it was when Biden ran in 2020. On the rural side, I think what we're seeing is a little bit of the religious side of things. I also think in urban areas, there's a lot more political education that's gone on in the Latino community that leads people to think and vote in a more progressive direction. But I guess I should congratulate your experts for getting closer.
Go back to the audience in just a second. I want to give you a chance to talk more about your institute at USC, though, the Equity Research Institute, who is producing a lot of data and thinking about or looking at data and analyzing data. And with the election right now, I'm wondering if you could say more about how you go about doing this with the team of scholars that you have there, researchers, and which topics you're choosing to research, and if that's going to be changing post-election, or are you going to continue the kinds of things that you're doing?
So the Equity Research Institute do a lot of work on economic justice issues, and we maintain, along with a group called PolicyLink, the National Equity Atlas, which is kind of a scorecard on racial equity for the nation's metro areas, 100 largest cities, 400 counties, all 50 states. That work will continue. We've done a lot of work on climate. That's going to be interesting to see how it plays out. Because you have the state of California, which will continue to lean in, I think, on climate. Today, the CEO of ExxonMobil urged the incoming Trump administration to not pull out of the Paris Climate Accords. Because as much as drill baby drill is an attractive slogan, even the oil companies know that baking the planet is not a great long-term strategy. And they want to be part of that transition. So I don't know where our climate work is going to go, but I do find that interesting. And I'll say something about democracy at the end of this, but I'll say a little bit more about the data. We also maintain the California Immigrant Data Portal, which has a lot of data, including on undocumented people. You might ask why we have a national atlas, but only a California Immigrant Data Portal, because we don't trust the rest of the United States with that data. They might use it to punish rather than protect. Before the election, we put out a set of maps on the naturalized vote so that new citizens could be encouraged to vote. And I think a lot of our work will continue and will probably accelerate in some ways that might be a little unexpected. You know, during Trump 1.0, we grew from about 12 people to 25 because there was so much need for data on the part of organizations that wanted to engage in protection. We're now about 30. I'm 68. I want it to slow down. But I think that we will wind up having to step up and generate more of these charts that you saw, but also more of this analysis about the long-term fault lines that need to be addressed. One word about democracy. It's prompted by the question, but like most academics, I can pretend to answer your question and just say what I want. But one of the things I think became really clear in this election to me is the difference between democracy as production and engagement versus democracy as consumption and spectacle. Production and engagement is going to a local meeting, city council meeting, school board meeting, knocking on doors, talking to your neighbors, being truly engaged, and being willing to engage in civic participation and conversation with people who are not like you. Democracy as consumption is this: following the TikToks you like, the social media you like, and never having to actually meet anyone you disagree with. It's voting, which is consumption. It's listening to your favorite podcast. Joe Rogan is spectacle. But so was much, particularly of the Trump campaign, some extent of the Harris campaign. Drill, baby, drill is spectacle. Even the oil companies don't want to do it. But it makes you feel like you're going to conquer nature. Mass deportation now. We can't really do that. Imagine what your farmers are going to say. Because do they really think US-born people in Bakersfield are heading out to the fields? No, but the cruelty of it, of deporting some people, is the spectacle that some people want to see. And while you can kind of blame that on one particular party or one particular rhetoric, we have accepted democracy as consumption rather than democracy as production. Democracy as spectacle rather than democracy as civic engagement.
Well, yes, thank you. Thank you for that response. I think, well, as I was saying earlier, we're hoping this is a call to action for people, but I do want to get back to some questions here. Yes, let's go. We've got the microphone on this side. We can bring up here. Oh, I'm sorry, in the back. Well, let's go to the back.
Yes, okay. Hi, thank you, Mr. Pastor, Professor, for being here, coming to CUCB. My name is Sophia Garcia. I wear many hats, but one of them is I work for Esri, which is a software mapping company, and I lead yes, thank you. I lead the work for equity, and I work with civic nonprofits. My career has been at the intersection of data, GIS, community engagement. All of my professional jobs didn't exist before I came on board. But my question, it was going to be centered around your work at the California Racial Equity Commission. I think that is really wonderful that we here in California have that. But I wanted to just ask you, in kind of the environment we're in, as you were saying about people who are really in the space of data ignorance and not really wanting to actually
And maybe the battery's low.
There we- And maybe if we could repeat that, or the question for the people on Zoom may not have heard
Oh,
that.
okay.
Yeah, I can give it a shot here. I apologize, but so understanding more about the California Racial Equity Commission and your work on the California Racial Equity Commission, both kind of what you're doing with that and how you're understanding data, and then how we can be involved, especially in the Central Valley, and making our voices heard in the work that you're doing.
Okay, well, your first name was Sophia? Okay, so Sophia knows that my heart just went pitter pat when she talked about GIS and Esri and data. Just that stuff is so important. So let me just say one thing generally, and then about the California Racial Equity Commission, which is that I think that there are many of us who are sort of scared of data, worried about numbers. Those of us who work with numbers know their power to move policymakers, business decision makers. We are also knowledgeable about the fact that every data point needs a story. It needs an explanation. And one of the biggest things that Esri, the mapping company, has really pushed along in recent years is GIS storyboards. So that we're not just seeing data, but we're getting stories that are attached to place. That's very, very important. For the California Racial Equity Commission, the thing I want to emphasize that I would hope that people who participate in the meetings keep coming back to is metrics and accountability. We in the state of California are legally constrained from using race to design a policy. Can't use affirmative action with racial categories. But you are not constrained from using race to investigate the impacts of a policy and to make it better to close racial equity gaps. So we know when we put more money into community colleges, we close racial equity gaps in the state of California. We know when we focus on cradle to career, we close racial equity gaps in the state of California. We know when we use CalEnviroscreen, we did the beta version of that with ArcGIS. Thank you very much. That when we allocate our money to places that are socially vulnerable, environmentally overexposed, we close racial gaps. So what I really hope we hear from the public is, number one, use the metrics to close the gaps. Number two, help us persuade. You could say force, we'll say persuade. State agencies to adopt these metrics. Number three, just because a group is small doesn't mean its story should be ignored. So how do we think about Black immigrants? How do we think about Native Californians? How do we think about LGBTQ communities of color that can get left to the wayside because the numbers aren't there? So how do we lift up data, but not make data the one and only thing? Let's pick up a few more questions and close.
Sounds great. We've got a microphone maybe that works over here now. We can
We
bring
have
it up. And then
one
over
there,
here too.
pick up two there.
I'm a recovering politician in the words of Jerry Brown. I'm also a graduate at an old age of this university in cultural anthropology. And I'm very concerned about information. My 40-year-old son gave me a t-shirt that said, "I'm waiting to make the truth legal again." How do you help us? We're in a sphere, you said here. We can all agree, we have good brains, we know how to use them because we're at a university. But how do we break in and fight misinformation that voters logically believe? How do we break out of the sphere we're in here at the university? And how do we make people understand what reality is?
Nada told me that all the questions would be easy. Clearly wrong. So first, moving back to one of the first questions, the disinformation in Spanish is worse than it is in English because there's not as much moderation going on. That's part of the shift in the votes too. And I do think that, I tweeted about this the other day because Elon Musk's purchase of Twitter, his ability to lose $30 billion on it in order to turn it into a cesspool of disinformation. Or if you say something on there that's a lie, all that happens is that something gets posted saying community content, responding, saying this is inaccurate, instead of removing stuff that's not true. And I fear this is going to get worse. And that it's also promoted by foreign agents who want to see us tearing each other apart. So the one thing I would say is, what can we in the university do to try to get more information and engagement into the community? We did that book, and then we did a comic book. We need more comic books. We need more willingness to talk simply. I talked about this in a class today, but I would urge you to think. You spent an hour and a half with me. How many big words did I use? How many weird, obscure, only useful in the university words did I use? What can we do to engage publicly and speak simply? One last thing is, how do we change the incentive structure at our universities to reward going public? Right now, you get tenure for publishing in journals read by other experts. But an op-ed community conversation doesn't count. We need to change that incentive structure to produce more public intellectuals. My voice is tiring out, so let's pick up two more questions, one here, one there, and then we'll close. And if it's okay with you, we'll pick up both of them and I'll answer both of them.
Thank you, Dr. Pastor, for being here. My name is Carter Beardsley, and I'm a local high school student here in Bakersfield. So, I'm patiently waiting for my entrance into college where I can spend the next 4 years and then hopefully enter the workforce. But and I might be naive in saying this, but I don't think that 4 years ago we were probably as concerned about job security with relation to artificial intelligence as we are now. So I can't even imagine what it's going to look like when it's my turn. Knowing that the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer, as well as as you mentioned, the retirees relying more on younger folk like myself. I know that there's a lot of unknown out there, but especially with this past election not seeming like it's giving a ton of security for the working class, with job security being even more in jeopardy now for younger people, as well as seemingly the reliance on us to provide. What does that mean for us?
Let's pick up the last question and then don't worry, I won't forget that one.
Hi, thank you, Dr. Pastor. My name is Reina Olagues, and I work with Building Healthy Communities Kern. And one of the things that we were very excited about when we learned of the state initiative called SURF, now known as California Jobs First, it allowed our communities to dream together and create a regional plan that was going to be centered on community and equity. But we're seeing shifts, substantial shifts right now that are moving away from centering community and centering environmental justice and our most disinvested communities. And so we're very concerned. Are you aware of the shifts, and what can we do to make sure that it works the way it was supposed to work, bottom up instead of top down?
Great, so I'll do these questions in reverse order. So first, I do think that shifts occurring. I think SURF, the fact that SURF was renamed Jobs First was the first signal. Because economic resilience had aspects of environmental sustainability and equity built right in. And you just saw in those charts what Jobs First looks like. You're doing pretty good on jobs. They're just not good. And you're very reliant on an oil industry, which creates problems for the planet. Some good jobs for some, but problems for community health as well. I think it started with more of a focus on environment and equity. And I think it's lost some of that, can be recaptured. And I think there's two reasons for it. The first is losing control of the story, the narrative. And I think we'd made a lot of good arguments during the COVID era about why we needed to depend on one another, who were really the essential workers, and they weren't stockbrokers, and why we needed to pull together. And then I think, and why we needed to deal with racial inequity. And I would say there's always a tendency for that kind of story to get lost. But I think that people who are progressive and care about racial justice always need to keep coming back to the common ground, to building alliances that are bigger and bigger and bigger. The second reason, I think, that allows me to segue into your great question is power. Who has power? Who can wield power? And we need to think more creatively about how to build power, because the nature of the conversation is driven by who has power. And one of the things in that book, Solidarity Economics, the subtitles Why Mutuality and Movements Matter. Mutuality is seeing the common ground. Movement is building power to make change. And that gets to your great question. You asked about job security. But the first thing I want to say is that I'm surprised your generation is not more pissed off than your financial crash. That screwed things up. Obama gave people hope, immediately ripped away. Trump got elected, which was pretty much an insult to every young person because of the issues that they care about. Then COVID. Wow, what a signal of mismanagement. Baby boomers who are happy with their housing wealth, unconcerned, seems, with your inability to access housing. And then not willing to do what we need to do to make you as successful as you need to be. So let me just say, my first bit of advice is get angry. This doesn't need to be this way. The 1% running away from the rest, that's kind of recent. It can change. Bring me back, I'll talk about how. But the second thing I want to say has a little bit to do with artificial intelligence, which is neither artificial nor is it intelligent. It's stealing. What artificial intelligence is large language models that scrape the internet and then privatize the common knowledge and sell it back to you. That ChatGPT read our book more quickly than you could. But all of its questions come from the good questions other people have developed over the years to interrogate knowledge. Google makes money because of your data and your purchasing records. And there's so much in which the commons are being appropriated privately as wealth, when they're really wealth that is generated collectively. And we need to shift the argument to talk about how it is we collectively generate knowledge and wealth, and how that should be returned in the form of wealth, dividends, and security for your generation. But get mad.
Okay, Good note to end on here, a note of action anyway for us. Please join me in thanking Dr. Pastor. Give him a couple of minutes, then he's going to be out in the lobby signing some copies of his book out there. I hope you go take a look out there, Russo's books. Support our local independent bookseller as well. So thank you for being here tonight, and we look forward to seeing you again at a Kegley Institute of Ethics event in the future. Thank you.